The debris field around Vale Corridor 7 was old, chunks of dead rock and frozen gas drifting in slow circles, since before either species had discovered fire. Nothing moved out here without a reason. So when the Sarathi long-range sensor post picked up an incoming transit signature, every operator on duty turned to look. The signature was wrong from the start. Clean transit folds produced a tight, compressed energy ring, a bright circle of collapsed space that snapped open and shut in under a second. What the sensors picked up instead was a long, grinding tear, like something forcing its way through a door that was too small. The fold stayed open for 11 seconds. 11. The station record was 3. Then the ship came through. It was big. Not in the way Sarathi carriers were big, smooth, and tapered, built to move through space like a blade through water. This vessel was wide and heavy, and covered in plates that overlapped like old armor. The hull was dark, almost brown in some places, with long scoring marks running bow to stern that the sensor AI immediately flagged as battle damage across multiple engagement classes. The ship moved at a steady pace, not fast, not slow, with the kind of unhurried weight that very large and very confident things tend to move with. Fleet engineer Solon pulled the auto assessment before the ship had even finished clearing the fold. The result came back in seconds. Hull class pre-modern, drive configuration, chain reaction propulsion deprecated, weapons profile, partial multiple ports reading as sealed or non-functional, estimated combat rating, minimal, recommended threat classification, non-hostile salvage candidate. Solon read the last line twice, then sent the report to High Admiral Verk. Verk looked at the image of the vessel on the main display. He looked at the report. He looked back at the vessel. Then he opened a channel. The human who answered did not look alarmed. She was somewhere in her 50s, with short gray hair and the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. She was not sitting. She was standing slightly to the left of center on what appeared to be a bridge that had been repaired so many times in so many different ways that it looked like a record of every bad day the ship had ever survived. Verk introduced himself with his full title and the full name of the Sarathi Grand Fleet. He informed her that she had entered a restricted corridor under active territorial review. He gave her 30 seconds to begin withdrawal. She waited for him to finish. Then she said her name was Vale and she commanded the UES Resolute. She told him she was there to collect her people, a science team that had been held aboard a Sarathi processing station for 9 days over a survey boundary dispute. She told him she would be leaving with them. She did not raise her voice. She did not seem nervous. She seemed, if anything, mildly inconvenienced. Verk muted the channel for a moment. Solon leaned in and said the obvious thing: the vessel was no threat. It was older than most Sarathi administrative records, and the fastest resolution was to let the humans file a standard petition and send them on their way. The petition process took 60 cycles. The humans would be gone, the science team would be processed properly, and everyone would save face. Verk reopened the channel and explained this to Vale. Vale said no. Not aggressively, not rudely, just clearly and without any indication that the answer surprised her or that she expected it to surprise him. She said the petition process was not something she was prepared to wait on, and that she would prefer to handle the matter directly. Verk ordered a patrol cruiser to begin flanking the Resolute. Standard posturing: place the vessel in a 2-point pressure position, make the geometry obvious, let the captain do the math herself. The patrol cruiser moved, and then the navigator reported something strange. His positioning data was feeding incorrectly. Not wildly wrong, just slightly off, in a way that would have been invisible under normal circumstances. But the flanking route he was trying to execute kept placing him 200 meters further from the Resolute than his display showed. He corrected. The error corrected with him. He stopped moving and the error stopped too. He reported it. Solon ran a diagnostic. Nothing came back wrong. He filed it as passive electromagnetic interference from the Resolute's aged drive systems and moved on. On the far side of the channel, Cadet Orel was standing at the back of the bridge watching all of this happen. He was 22 years old and 3 months into his first fleet posting, and he had very recently been taught that space was full of knowable things. He had been taught that a ship's classification told you what a ship could do, and that the assessment system had been refined over 400 years of encounters and was, statistically, extremely reliable. He wrote in his log, "The Resolute has not visibly done anything. The interference started when the cruiser began to flank, probably coincidence, flagging anyway." Vale opened a channel to the detained science team. She said 4 words. "Tell them we arrived." The channel closed. Verk looked at his tactical officer. The tactical officer looked at the Resolute. The Resolute sat in the middle of Vale Corridor 7 and did not move and did not speak, and its old, scored hull reflected the distant starlight the same way a stone reflects rain, without caring about it at all. Solon said, "She's bluffing." Nobody answered him. The inspection was Prith's idea. Formally, it was a diplomatic courtesy, a standard Sarathi right under the Vale Corridor access protocols, allowing the detaining fleet to board and verify the visiting vessel's registry and cargo manifest. Practically, it was meant to put the assessment on official record. A Sarathi officer walking through the Resolute and filing a report that said, "Confirmed. Old, harmless, not worth delaying fleet operations over," would give Verk clean documentation to justify the outcome either way. Cadet Orel was sent because he was the lowest-ranking technical observer on the flagship. Sending anyone senior would have suggested the inspection mattered. He crossed the docking collar alone with a data pad, a translation unit clipped to his collar, and the quiet certainty that this would take 40 minutes and be extremely boring. Lieutenant Falco met him on the other side. Falco was lean and unhurried and had a way of standing that made it look like he was waiting for something funny to happen. He shook Orel's hand, a human gesture Orel had studied but not experienced, and said he would show him whatever he wanted to see. Then he started walking. The first thing Orel noticed was the corridors. On Sarathi vessels, corridors were wide and clean and rooted in straight lines, because straight lines were efficient, and efficiency was the point of engineering. The Resolute's corridors were narrow enough that 2 people passing each other had to turn sideways, and they ran in long curves that took slightly longer to walk than a straight route would. The walls were lined with conduit runs, thick bundles of cable and pipe stacked in layered rows, and behind those, more conduit, and behind that, Orel suspected, more conduit still. He asked Falco what all the secondary runs were for. Falco said, "Backups." Orel wrote that down. He asked, "Backups for what?" Falco said, "For the backups." The engine room was worse. Orel had expected 1 drive core. The Resolute had 3, arranged in a triangle with each one running at low output. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at all 3 and said, without meaning to say it out loud, that the power overhead was enormous and that running 3 cores at partial output was less efficient than running 1 at full. The chief engineer, Moss, a small woman with grease on her forearms and the expression of someone who had heard this point made many times and was not tired of being right about it, looked up from a panel and said, "1 core goes down, we have 2. 2 go down, we have 1. 0 cores go down means we never needed the extras. We don't find that embarrassing." Falco said nothing. He was looking at the wall. Orel wrote it all down. He walked the length of the Resolute over the next 2 hours and filled his data pad with observations that didn't fit any category his training had given him. The hull plating, seen up close, was not damaged and not corroded. The surface texture was deliberate, a fine, irregular roughness patterned in a way that repeated at intervals too regular to be wear. He photographed it and his analysis tool returned, unknown material configuration. He photographed it again. Same result. The medical bay was fully stocked for a crew twice the size of the one aboard. The weapons lockers in the crew corridors were positioned at intervals that suggested someone had planned for the interior of the ship to become a combat zone and had prepared for that possibility without apparent concern. The damage control stations were manned even now, in the middle of a diplomatic standoff, by crew members who were reading manuals and running drills. Like this was a normal Tuesday. Aurel asked Falco how old the ship was. Falco said, "The hull is 180 years old. Everything inside has been rebuilt at least 4 times. She's as old as she needs to be." Aurel wrote that down. He stared at it for a while. Then he wrote underneath it, "This is not a philosophy of engineering. This is a philosophy of survival." He did not know yet how right he was. Back on the flagship, Solon was watching a secondary sensor readout when a new energy signature blinked on and off from inside the Resolute. It lasted less than 2 seconds. The system flagged it as a power fluctuation from the aging drive assembly and filed it automatically. Solon almost moved on. Then he looked at the frequency band. It was a low-range passive sensor emission, a band the Sarathi had deprecated 2 centuries ago because modern sensors had made it redundant. There was no reason a functioning ship would emit in that range. He ran a check. The emission had touched every Sarathi vessel in the corridor, bounced back and gone quiet. He sat with that for a moment. Then he told himself there was no way an 180-year-old vessel was running an active sensor array on a deprecated frequency to quietly map the fleet without triggering a single alert. That would require a level of operational patience and technical obscurity that was, frankly, insulting to consider. He filed it as a power fluctuation and closed the screen. On the Resolute, Dara Moss looked at her completed sensor map of the Sarathi fleet. Every ship, every position, every power output reading, all of it collected in silence on a frequency no one had thought to watch for in 200 years. She sent it to Falco's tactical station without a word. Falco looked at it. He smiled the way people smile when a plan they were not sure about turns out to be working exactly right. Aurel's inspection report landed on Solon's desk at the worst possible time, which was the moment that Verk had already decided what to do next. The Sarathi Council had sent a priority signal. The Vale corridor situation was becoming visible to parties they would prefer remain uninformed, and a swift, clean resolution was required. Verk had 12 hours. He cut that to 6 in his own mind because he did not like waiting. He cut it to 2 when Solon's earlier assessment confirmed the Resolute was not a real threat. By the time he called the command meeting, he had a plan, and he had the confidence of a man who had run the same calculation 4 times and received the same answer. He would fire a warning volley, not enough to cause hull breach, just enough to score the Resolute's plating and make clear that the corridor had an owner. Vale would understand the language. All naval captains did. Solon raised one hand. He said, "The inspection cadet filed a preliminary note. Several of the weapon ports we classified as sealed may have removable covers rather than permanent welds. He was not able to confirm under inspection conditions." Verk said, "Is the weapon assessment changed?" Solon said, "No. Even if the ports are functional, the energy reading behind them suggests weapon systems 2 generations below current Sarathi standard. It changes nothing tactically." Verk nodded and dismissed the concern. Aurel, standing at the back of the room, wrote in his log, "I should have pushed harder on the hull texture. I do not know what it is, and I should not have left without knowing what it is." He did not get a chance to go back. Verk hailed Vale one more time. It was a professional call. He gave her the full courtesy of a final offer, framed correctly, with room for her to accept without public loss of dignity. She could withdraw, file the petition, and the science team would be processed according to standard protocol. He was giving her the door. Vale said she appreciated the offer. She said the answer was still no. She said she was sorry to be difficult, and she hoped he understood she was not trying to be rude. Verk said he understood. Then he closed the channel and ordered the warning volley. 3 precision bolts, sequential, targeting the port midship section of the Resolute. Calibrated at 40% output, enough to leave visible marks on any standard hull, not enough to threaten crew safety. The Sarathi had done this hundreds of times. The math was routine. The bolts crossed the distance in just under a second. They hit. On the flagship bridge, every sensor operator watched their screens. They expected to see hull scoring, 3 clean lines cut into the old plating, evidence of impact, evidence of message received. They would record it. Verk would file it. Vale would think about her options. What they saw instead was heat. The Resolute's port hull temperature spiked across a wide area, not at the 3 impact points but across the entire port quarter, spreading out from the hits like ripples in water. The energy didn't concentrate. It moved. It distributed itself across the hull's surface in a fraction of a second and bled off as thermal radiation without ever focusing into a single breach point. The scoring was almost invisible. Solon stared at his readouts. He ran the impact calculation again. At 40% output against a hull of the Resolute's rated thickness, the expected penetration depth was 4.2 centimeters. The actual penetration depth, according to his sensors, was less than 0.3. The hull had not failed. It had redirected the energy sideways, the way a sloped surface deflects a falling object, not by being stronger, but by refusing to stand still and absorb it. His damage assessment model tried to classify what had happened and returned an error. It had no category for this result. On the Resolute's bridge, nobody flinched. Vale had felt the impact through the deck, 3 short pulses, like someone knocking politely. She looked at the hull temperature readout. She looked at the breach indicator, which read 0. She looked at Moss, who was watching the same screen, and nodded once. Vale opened a channel to the flagship. She said, "Admiral, I think your weapons may be malfunctioning. You should run a diagnostic before this becomes embarrassing." Then she closed the channel. Verk did not speak for a full 4 seconds. 4 seconds is a long time on a command bridge. Solon said, very quietly, that he would like to recommend a tactical pause to reassess the hull composition data before proceeding. Verk looked at the Resolute on the display. The ship had not moved. It had not raised shields, or at least nothing that read as a shield on Sarathi sensors. It had been hit by a warning volley that should have left visible marks, and the marks were barely there. He thought about Solon's recommendation. He thought about the Sarathi Council's timeline. He thought about the fact that there were 6 ships in this corridor, and one of them was a 180-year-old human vessel rated as non-combat. He ordered a full combat volley. Solon opened his mouth. Verk said, "Full volley, all ships now." At the back of the bridge, Aurel picked up his data pad and began writing as fast as he could. He did not know what was about to happen, but he had spent 2 hours inside the Resolute, and he had a feeling, a strong, specific, professionally humiliating feeling, that the fleet was about to find out something nobody had thought to put in the classification system. The Sarathi ships charged weapons. On the Resolute, blast plates blew off 17 weapon ports in perfect sequence, and Lieutenant Ren Falco leaned forward in his chair and got to work. Nobody in the Sarathi fleet had ever seen a ship fire like that. It was not accurate in the way Sarathi fire was accurate, precise bolts, targeted at specific hull sections, calculated to achieve maximum damage with minimum energy spent. What came out of the Resolute's 17 newly opened ports was something closer to a storm. Overlapping volleys, staggered by a fraction of a second each, aimed not at any single point but at wide zones that covered every approach angle simultaneously. The shots did not hit hard individually. They hit constantly. The 2 Sarathi escort frigates on the outer edge of the formation took the first wave. Their point defense grids were good, among the best in current fleet configuration, and for the first 11 seconds they held. Then the 12th wave hit, and the 13th, and the grids did what any system does when it is asked to process more than it was built to process. They slowed. The 14th wave got through. The 15th wave found the gaps the 14th had made. Both frigates went weapons dark inside 90 seconds. Their hulls held. Their crews were alive, but they were no longer part of the fight, and their absence changed the geometry of everything. Solon was watching 6 screens at once and failing to keep up with any of them. The Resolute's firing pattern was not in the tactical database. It was not in any database he had access to. It was a doctrine built around a specific assumption, that your weapons are individually weaker than the enemy's. So you do not fight with individual weapons. You fight with volume, and you make volume so continuous and unpredictable that no automated defense system can establish a reliable response pattern. It was a solution to a problem the Sarathi had never had. He said this out loud, without meaning to. Verk said, "What problem?" Solon said, "The problem of being outgunned and surviving anyway." Nobody had a response to that. The 3 Sarathi cruisers broke into their compensating formation, the standard counter to volume fire, repositioning to reduce the total surface area exposed to incoming fire while concentrating return fire on a single target. It was the correct tactical response. It was exactly what the book said to do. It was also exactly what Falco had predicted they would do, because he had the complete fleet map Moss had built during the inspection, and he had plotted firing solutions for the compensated positions 2 hours ago. The Resolute did not chase them. It waited, and when the cruisers arrived at their new positions, the firing solutions were already loaded. The lead cruiser took 3 hits to its forward section before its shield stabilized. The second cruiser absorbed 2. The third managed to fire back, a clean, powerful bolt that hit the Resolute's starboard bow and made the whole ship shudder. Hodgen, in the medical bay, caught herself on a console rail and kept moving. She had 2 crew members with impact injuries from the earlier volley, and she was working through both of them without stopping, one hand pressing a seal on a burn wound, while her eyes tracked the biometric feed from the science team being held on the processing station across the corridor. All 9 of them were stressed but uninjured. She kept that number in her head like a second heartbeat. She noted the shudder. She looked at the hull integrity panel, green. She went back to the burn wound. The carrier deployed its fighters. It was Verk's best card, and he played it when he had to, which was the right time to play it. Sarathi fighters were fast and precise, and designed to swarm a large vessel from multiple angles, delivering concentrated short-range fire to specific weak points. Against most ships, this worked extremely well. The fighters came in on 6 vectors. They were fast, and their approach patterns were elegant. They closed to medium range and began their targeting sequences. Moss activated the second power core. The point defense mesh that came online had been running cold for the entire engagement, cold enough that it registered as inactive on every Sarathi scan taken since the Resolute arrived. It was an older system, slower to respond than current generation equivalents, but at medium range against fighters with committed approach vectors, slow response was not the problem it would have been against capital ships. The fighters could not break off in time. The mesh found them in groups. 11 fighters were disabled in 40 seconds. The remaining 7 broke off and returned to the carrier at full speed. Then the Resolute's primary guns, the ones that had been sitting behind blast plates since before the engagement started, fired at the carrier's drive section. 3 shots, all 3 hit. The carrier did not explode. It listed. Its transit drive went dark. Its repair crews would later confirm it had taken structural damage to the drive mounting that rendered it unable to fold. It was not destroyed. It was simply not going anywhere. The battle math at that point had changed in a very complete way. Verk looked at his tactical display. 2 frigates with no weapons, a carrier with no drive, cruisers still functional but positioned defensively. 34 minutes had passed since the full volley was ordered. 34 minutes. He thought about Solin's recommendation to pause. He thought about it at some length. Then he opened a channel to the Resolute. Vale was standing where she had been standing since before the first shot. There was a burn across her left forearm she had not stopped to treat. Behind her, the Resolute's bridge showed the evidence of a ship that had just been in a real fight. One panel dark, one crew member working a manual override, smoke residue on the far wall that someone was already cleaning up. She looked at him and waited. Verk said, "Captain Vale, I believe we should talk about the science team." Vale said, "Yes, I think we should." The science team came across the docking collar in a group of 9, carrying their equipment cases and wearing the careful expressions of people who had been in a bad situation long enough to stop being surprised by it. Hodgen met them at the airlock with water and medical kits, and the specific kind of calm that is not performed but practiced, earned over years of being the first person hurt people see after something difficult. She scanned each of them quickly, asked 3 questions each, and had the 2 who needed attention in the medical bay within 8 minutes. The other 7 were given food and directed to rest quarters. Nobody made a speech about it. The ship absorbed them and kept moving. Across the corridor, aboard the Sarathi flagship, Ambassador Prith had taken the main diplomatic channel from Verk, politely, firmly, in the way that Prith did most things. Verk was still there, seated at the side of the room, watching. He had not left. He was a man with enough self-knowledge to understand that removing himself from this conversation would be worse than the discomfort of staying in it. The formal negotiation lasted 40 minutes and resolved nothing that was not already decided by the engagement. The science team was released. The corridor access dispute was deferred to a joint review. Both sides agreed to withdraw to their respective transit corridors. These things were said and recorded and signed with the appropriate codes. The real conversation happened afterward. Prith arranged a technical liaison channel between Solon and Moss, framed as a post-engagement safety review to confirm no hazardous materials had been released during the battle. This was a fiction that both engineers understood immediately and neither of them questioned, because they both wanted the same thing, which was to understand what had happened. Solon's first question was about the hull. Moss explained it without hesitation. The reactive lattice had been developed during the Kuiper siege, a conflict the Sarathi had no direct knowledge of, a 7-year engagement in which human forces had faced an enemy with significantly heavier weapons and no option to disengage. The lattice was a solution to a specific problem. How do you stop a ship from dying when the hits are going to land no matter what you do? You do not make the hull harder. You make the energy move. Solon said, "Why have we never encountered this technology?" Moss said, "You have not been in the engagements we have been in." Solon wrote that down. He sat with it for a moment. Then he asked about the tertiary sensor grid. Moss said it ran on a deprecated frequency band. The Sarathi had stopped using it 200 years ago. It was less efficient than modern systems. Solon said, "Then why do you still run it?" Moss said, "Because it still works. Efficient and effective are not the same thing." Solon looked at the translated words on his screen for a long time. He asked why the Sarathi had missed it entirely during their scans. Moss said, "You stopped looking for things you decided weren't worth looking for. That's a reasonable thing to do. It just leaves gaps." There was a pause in the channel. Solon filled it by reviewing his notes from the engagement, which were extensive and filled with the kind of tight, careful language that engineers use when they are documenting something they do not yet have the right words for. He asked about the firing doctrine, the volume fire approach that had overwhelmed the frigate's point defense grids. Moss said she would send him a reference document. The document she sent was a tactical manual from the Kuiper siege, 140 years old, written by a human naval strategist who had understood that the correct response to being outmatched in individual firepower was to make the engagement too busy to manage cleanly. The manual was simple and clear, and its logic was obvious in retrospect. Solon read the first chapter in the time it took for the channel to stay open. He said, "This was written 140 years ago." Moss said, "Yes." He said, "And you still use it." Moss said, "The math didn't change." Verk, listening through a quiet relay that Prith had allowed him, stood up from his chair and walked to the window. The Vale corridor was still outside, still full of slow drifting rock, and the Resolute was visible on the edge of the display, sitting where it had sat since it arrived, patient and dark and warm from the fight. He said to no one in particular, "How many of those ships do they have?" Prith was the only one close enough to hear. He said, "I asked." Verk waited. Prith said, "She told me the Resolute is one of their older ones." Verk absorbed that. He looked at the Resolute for a long time. Solon appeared at his shoulder and said the thing that had been forming in his mind for the past hour, slowly and then all at once, the way understanding tends to arrive. "It is not that they are more advanced, Admiral. It is that they decided advancement meant something different. We built for precision and efficiency. They built for survival. We never had to survive the way they did, so we never built the way they build." Verk said, "And which approach was correct?" Solon said, "I don't think it's a question of correct. I think it's a question of what you've been through." On the far side of the technical channel, Moss had closed her panel and was writing up the post-engagement systems report. She worked through it methodically, each system, each reading, each result. Every major system was functional. The reactive lattice had resealed. The sensor grid was still running. All three cores were cycling normally. She got to the final line of the report. She wrote, "Operational. No critical degradation." Then she looked at the ship around her, at the warm walls and the sound of the engines and the familiar smell of recycled air and old metal, and she added 4 words at the bottom. She held. She held. The last thing Verk did before the Resolute began its transit preparation was call Vale one more time. Not formally. No titles, no fleet designations. He opened a channel and she answered, and for a few seconds neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation between two people who had just been in a real situation together and were not quite ready to file it away. He said, "Your ship took a direct hit to the starboard bow in the middle of the engagement. Full power bolt from my 3rd cruiser." Vale said, "I remember." Verk said, "Your hull did not breach." Vale said, "No." He said, "At full power, that bolt should have opened a hole 3 meters wide in any hull I have ever encountered." Vale said, "I know." He said, "What are your hull plates made of?" Vale said, "Effort." Then, after a pause, "And a composite layered system developed by a materials engineer named Pryor during the Kuiper siege who needed to solve a problem and had very limited time and no good options. It has been improved 17 times since then. The current version works fairly well." Verk said, "It works more than fairly well." Vale said, "Yes, it does." He thanked her. She said she was sorry the situation had reached the point it reached. She sounded like she meant it. He believed her. The channel closed. Falco was in the ship's narrow rear corridor reviewing the combat log when he found the thing that was bothering him. He had been feeling it since the carrier's fighters broke off, a low, specific discomfort that had taken him an hour to locate. He went to Vale and said it plainly. He said, "The carrier could have ended us in the first 3 minutes. If Verk had fired the carrier's main battery before playing the frigates and the cruisers, we would not have had time to fully unseal the weapon ports. He played by the doctrine order. He used his lesser assets first." Vale said, "Yes." Falco said, "Their doctrine failed them, not their ships." Vale said, "Yes, remember that." Falco went back to his station and added a note to the combat log. He wrote it clearly, the way you write something that matters. The Sarathi ships are capable. Their systems are powerful. What beat them today was a set of assumptions they had followed for so long that they had stopped being decisions and become habits. Habits are predictable. Predictable things can be planned for. He saved the note and did not show it to anyone. It was for the next engagement, whichever one that turned out to be. The Resolute began its transit spin-up, while the Sarathi fleet was still running damage assessments. The drive sequence was long and loud compared to Sarathi transit standards, a deep, building vibration that started in the engine room and traveled through the hull into the floors and walls and the soles of everyone's boots. It was not graceful. It was not quiet. It was the sound of a very large, very old, very serious piece of machinery doing what it was built to do. Aurel, watching from the flagship observation window, felt the vibration from across the corridor through the hull of his own ship. He was writing in his personal log, not the official inspection report, which was already filed, but the private one he kept in a notebook, because he had learned early that the most important observations don't always belong in official documents right away. He wrote about the engine room with its 3 cores. He wrote about the conduit-lined corridors and what Falco had said about backups for the backups. He wrote about the hull texture that his analysis tool had failed to classify. He wrote, "I went to inspect a ship that was supposed to be obsolete, and I found a philosophy I did not have words for. I still do not have all the words. I think I will spend the rest of my career finding them." He closed the notebook when the Resolute's fold began to form. It was nothing like a Sarathi fold. A Sarathi transit fold was a clean ring, compressed, bright, perfectly circular, open for less than 2 seconds. The Resolute's fold was a long, ragged tear in space, like the ship was pulling the corridor open with both hands and stepping through before it could close. It stayed open for 12 seconds. The light that came through it was the wrong color, which nobody had a good explanation for. Then the Resolute went through. The fold closed behind it. The Veil corridor was quiet. 3 weeks later, in an intelligence processing station in the Sarathi interior, an analyst named Barrett received Solon's full technical report. It was long and carefully written, and it contained 22 separate observations that had no current classification in the Sarathi technical database. She read it cover to cover, which took most of a shift, and then she did something no one had asked her to do. She pulled the records of every previous human vessel encounter filed over the past 50 years. There were hundreds of them. Most were brief, most were classified as resolved without significance, and most were closed. She began reading through the anomaly sections, the parts of incident reports where things happened that didn't quite fit and were filed under equipment variance, or sensor irregularity, or non-repeating event. She found 34 separate incidents where human ships had performed in ways their classification profiles did not predict. 34 times, something had happened that did not match the model, and 34 times, the model had been kept and the event had been filed away. She opened a new folder. She labeled it Reassessment. Then she started reading from the beginning.